The winter of 1944 was supposed to be just another chapter of suffering for the German prisoners of war shipped across the Atlantic. Most of them had spent months retreating through ruined cities, sleeping in trenches, and watching their rations shrink to almost nothing. By the time they were captured, many were skin and bone, their faces hollow, their uniforms stiff with dirt and desperation. They expected the worst from captivity in America. They imagined harsh treatment, starvation, humiliation, maybe even beatings. Anything seemed possible in war. So when the group of prisoners was marched into a large wooden hall in a Texas POW camp, they braced themselves. Their boots scraped across the floor as they entered, shoulders tense, eyes fixed on the ground. But instead of anger or shouting, they were met with a warm, unexpected smell. One they had not sensed in months, maybe years. It was a soft, rich scent, something that floated through the hall like a memory from childhood. At the far end of the room, American cooks were scooping generous portions of mashed potatoes onto metal trays, then pouring steaming brown gravy over the top. The POWs froze in confusion. Back home, their families were surviving on thin rations, chopped turnips, and bread made with sawdust. Many of these soldiers had spent entire weeks in the field with nothing but a crust of stale bread. The sight of real food, warm, plentiful, and prepared for them, didn't make any sense. Some whispered among themselves, convinced it was a mistake. Others stared blankly, unable to believe that their enemy would offer them something so comforting. A sergeant, older than most, simply shook his head and muttered, "Impossible. This cannot be for us." But it was. The American cooks, many of them young farm boys who had never seen a battlefield, served each prisoner calmly, without judgment or cruelty. To them, this was just their duty: feed the men even if they wore the wrong uniform. The POWs sat down slowly, almost nervously. The wooden benches creaked under their weight. One prisoner, a 19-year-old from Bremen, held his spoon like it was a fragile artifact. He hesitated before taking the first bite. When the warm potatoes touched his tongue, he closed his eyes. The taste was simple, humble, but to him it was overwhelming. It reminded him of Sunday lunches at home, of his mother stirring pots in a small kitchen, of a time before the war stole everything familiar. The emotions he had buried for so long rose all at once. His breath trembled. He tried to swallow it down, but it was too late. A tear rolled down his cheek, then another. He lowered his head, hiding his face behind his hands. But the men around him understood. They felt it too. Some wiped their eyes discreetly. Others stared into their plates, fighting the ache in their throats. Soldiers who had survived bombings, freezing nights, and the terror of combat now found themselves undone by a plate of warm food. An American cook noticed the young man's shoulders shaking. He didn't laugh, didn't mock him, didn't say a word. Instead, he stepped closer and quietly placed a second helping of potatoes on the prisoner's tray. The gesture was small, but it carried a weight the young German could hardly bear. Kindness from someone he had been told to hate felt more powerful than any weapon. For the first time since the war began, these men felt something other than fear and hunger. They felt human again, and in that simple dining hall, thousands of miles from home, they were reminded that compassion could survive even in the darkest moments of history. This was the unexpected story behind their tears, a story not of weakness, but of humanity returning to men who thought they had lost it forever. By 1943 and 1944, the German soldiers who would eventually become POWs in America came from every corner of a collapsing nation. Some were hardened veterans of the Afrika Korps, men who had fought under scorching desert sun and survived on rations barely fit for animals. Others were teenage recruits, barely trained, handed a rifle, and told that defending the Reich was their destiny. There were Luftwaffe pilots who had been shot down over North Africa, Wehrmacht infantry captured in France, and entire units that surrendered during the final chaos of the Western Front. Many of these men were worn down long before they ever saw an American soldier up close. Months of retreat had hollowed them out, physically and mentally. They marched through towns reduced to rubble, past starving civilians, and into battles they knew they could not win. Every day brought more news of cities bombed, families displaced, and food supplies shrinking to nothing. By the time Allied forces surrounded them, many were too exhausted to resist. To them, the war already felt lost. Captured soldiers expected harsh punishment. German propaganda had painted Americans as brutal, eager to torture and humiliate their captives. So when they laid down their rifles, their hands trembled. Some whispered prayers. Others prepared themselves for beatings or worse. But instead of cruelty, they found something unexpected: order, professionalism, and even a strange kind of calm. They were given water, medical attention, and transport to ports where ships waited to carry them across the Atlantic. The journey to America felt surreal. On the ships, many POWs saw piles of food, bread, eggs, meat, unimaginable abundance compared to ration-starved Germany. Some prisoners asked quietly, "Is this really for us?" Others avoided eating too much, afraid it might be a trick. But it wasn't. Even at sea, they were treated according to Geneva Convention rules that many of them had never believed were real. When the prisoners finally arrived in the United States, they were stunned by what they saw. American towns seemed untouched by war. Fields were green, filled with crops. Factories were running. Children played in the streets. For men coming from ruins and hunger, it felt like stepping into another world. Their guards didn't shout at them. Civilians didn't throw stones. Some even looked at them with curiosity rather than hatred. Inside the POW camps, the diversity of the men became more obvious. There were farmers from Bavaria, machinists from Hamburg, mechanics from Cologne, university students who had been drafted against their will, and fathers who had left children behind. Despite wearing the same uniform, they were not the same. Some had believed deeply in the Nazi cause. Others had never wanted the war in the first place. Many were simply trying to survive another day. What united them was the feeling of loss. Loss of home, loss of dignity, loss of hope. But life in captivity, strangely enough, began to restore some of what the war had taken away. They received regular meals, safe shelter, and the first sense of stability they had felt in years. The men who arrived broken and frightened slowly began to resemble ordinary people again. Not warriors, not enemies, just human beings caught in the machinery of history. These were the POWs who would soon sit in an American dining hall, taste warm food they had forgotten existed, and find themselves overcome by a moment of unexpected humanity. By 1943 and 1944, the German soldiers who would eventually become POWs in America came from every corner of a collapsing nation. Some were hardened veterans of the Afrika Korps, men who had fought under scorching desert sun and survived on rations barely fit for animals. Others were teenage recruits, barely trained, handed a rifle, and told that defending the Reich was their destiny. There were Luftwaffe pilots who had been shot down over North Africa, Wehrmacht infantry captured in France, and entire units that surrendered during the final chaos of the Western Front. Many of these men were worn down long before they ever saw an American soldier up close. Months of retreat had hollowed them out, physically and mentally. They marched through towns reduced to rubble, past starving civilians, and into battles they knew they could not win. Every day brought more news of cities bombed, families displaced, and food supplies shrinking to nothing. By the time Allied forces surrounded them, many were too exhausted to resist. To them, the war already felt lost. Captured soldiers expected harsh punishment. German propaganda had painted Americans as brutal, eager to torture and humiliate their captives. So when they laid down their rifles, their hands trembled. Some whispered prayers. Others prepared themselves for beatings or worse. But instead of cruelty, they found something unexpected: order, professionalism, and even a strange kind of calm. They were given water, medical attention, and transport to ports where ships waited to carry them across the Atlantic. The journey to America felt surreal. On the ships, many POWs saw piles of food, bread, eggs, meat, unimaginable abundance compared to ration-starved Germany. Some prisoners asked quietly, "Is this really for us?" Others avoided eating too much, afraid it might be a trick. But it wasn't. Even at sea, they were treated according to Geneva Convention rules that many of them had never believed were real. When the prisoners finally arrived in the United States, they were stunned by what they saw. American towns seemed untouched by war. Fields were green, filled with crops. Factories were running. Children played in the streets. For men coming from ruins and hunger, it felt like stepping into another world. Their guards didn't shout at them. Civilians didn't throw stones. Some even looked at them with curiosity rather than hatred. Inside the POW camps, the diversity of the men became more obvious. There were farmers from Bavaria, machinists from Hamburg, mechanics from Cologne, university students who had been drafted against their will, and fathers who had left children behind. Despite wearing the same uniform, they were not the same. Some had believed deeply in the Nazi cause. Others had never wanted the war in the first place. Many were simply trying to survive another day. What united them was the feeling of loss. Loss of home, loss of dignity, loss of hope. But life in captivity, strangely enough, began to restore some of what the war had taken away. They received regular meals, safe shelter, and the first sense of stability they had felt in years. The men who arrived broken and frightened slowly began to resemble ordinary people again. Not warriors, not enemies, just human beings caught in the machinery of history. These were the POWs who would soon sit in an American dining hall, taste warm food they had forgotten existed, and find themselves overcome by a moment of unexpected humanity. When the German prisoners settled into their new lives inside American POW camps, many felt an unexpected sense of disbelief. The word camp had filled their minds with dread, images of punishment, starvation, and fear. But what they found behind the gates was something entirely different, something they struggled to understand. In most camps across the United States, from Texas to Nebraska to Tennessee, the daily life of a POW was strangely structured, calm, and even humane. Their barracks were simple wooden buildings, lined with neatly arranged bunks and windows that let in warm light during the day. They were not luxurious, but they were clean, heated, and safe, something many of these soldiers had not experienced in months. For men who had slept in shell craters, barns, and frozen foxholes, the sight of an actual mattress felt almost unreal. Some touched the blankets cautiously, as if expecting them to be taken away at any moment. But they weren't. The barracks were theirs, their new reality. Each day began with a routine that reminded them of normal life. A morning bell, roll call, breakfast. The idea of scheduled meals, real meals, was deeply unfamiliar. In Germany, even civilians were starving. Bread lines stretched for blocks, and meat was a memory from better times. But in American POW camps, food arrived 3 times a day. There was bread, vegetables, sometimes meat, and always hot coffee. Many prisoners whispered among themselves in the early days, wondering if the kindness would disappear. Yet every morning, the same steady rhythm continued. Camp life was organized with surprising fairness. The men could work if they wished, cutting wood, farming, repairing equipment, cooking, or assisting with local harvests. For their labor, they earned small wages in camp currency, which they could use at canteens to buy postcards, razors, chocolate, or small comforts they hadn't seen in years. Some POWs even joked that they were being treated better here than by their own commanders back home. Free time existed, something they had almost forgotten. Many camps offered libraries filled with donated books. Some prisoners taught each other languages or mathematics. Others formed orchestras, crafting makeshift instruments from scrap wood and wire. In several camps, German prisoners built theaters, performing plays to pass the long evenings. Guards would sometimes stand outside, listening quietly to music drifting through the air. Letters were allowed, too. POWs wrote home under strict rules, but receiving envelopes stamped from Germany felt like a lifeline. For many, it was the only way to know whether their families had survived the bombings. When mail arrived, the entire camp changed. Voices softened, eyes brightened, and men gathered under the dim barack lights to read their precious messages again and again. Despite the fences and guard towers, violence was rare. American guards had little desire for cruelty. Many were young farm boys or factory workers who treated the prisoners with a simple, straightforward respect. Tensions occasionally flared, but they faded quickly. Life in the camps was built on an unspoken understanding. As long as the prisoners followed the rules, they would be treated with dignity. For some POWs, this environment brought a strange sense of guilt. They knew their own army had not treated captured soldiers with such care. Others felt relief, a deep breath for the first time in years. Many quietly admitted that they were safer here than anywhere else in the world. No bombs fell on the camps. No officers shouted at them. No hunger gnawed at their stomachs. And as days turned into weeks, the reality sank in. This was not a place of punishment. It was a place of waiting. Waiting for the war to end. Waiting for news from home. Waiting for the future. The camps became a temporary world of their own, where fear slowly faded, replaced by routine, stability, and the rediscovery of humanity. They had come expecting suffering. Instead, they found something unexpected, the first taste of normal life they had known in a very long time. By the time German soldiers became prisoners in America, hunger had already carved itself deeply into their lives. For years, Germany had been sinking into a state of exhaustion. Cities were collapsing under Allied bombs, farms were failing, and supply lines were breaking apart. What little food civilians received was rationed strictly. Meat once a week if they were lucky, potatoes that sprouted before they could be cooked, and bread mixed with fillers to stretch the shrinking flour supply. Many families kept small gardens just to survive. Some traded clothes or valuables for a handful of eggs. Others went days eating nothing more than thin cabbage soup. Soldiers at the front often had it worse. Rations arrived late or didn't arrive at all. Many units boiled grass or stole livestock from abandoned farms. Some carried moldy crusts in their coat pockets, saving them for moments of absolute desperation. It was common for men to faint during marches. Hunger became a constant companion, a dull ache that followed them into battle, into trenches, into the quiet moments between artillery strikes. So when those same men arrived in America, the contrast hit them like a shock. The first glimpse came aboard the ships that transported them across the ocean. Instead of starvation, there were organized meals: bread, stew, fruit, even coffee. Some prisoners stared at their trays in disbelief. Others ate cautiously, expecting the portions to shrink the next day. But they didn't. The food supply remained consistent, almost unimaginably reliable. Once inside American POW camps, the difference grew even sharper. While German cities crumbled into rubble and families scavenged for potatoes, prisoners in the U.S. received meals based on official guidelines. Breakfast might include oatmeal, bread, butter, or eggs. Lunch often offered soups, vegetables, and sometimes meat. Dinner brought hearty servings, often simple but filling, served on metal trays lined up along steaming kitchen counters. At first, many POWs felt uneasy. They wondered how their enemy could feed them better than their own nation had. Some found it embarrassing, even shameful. A few refused to eat more than necessary, afraid of appearing weak or unworthy. But hunger does not care about pride. Within days, most prisoners ate gratefully, quietly, unsure how to express the mixture of relief and confusion growing inside them. American guards rarely understood the depth of this emotional impact. To them, it was simple. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, and America had enough food to provide it. But for the POWs, every meal carried memories. Memories of empty tables back home, mothers skipping meals so their children could eat, fathers standing in ration lines before dawn. Many wondered whether their families had enough to survive. Letters from home often confirmed their fears. Shortages, freezing winters, and neighbors dying from sickness and hunger. One prisoner later wrote that the first time he saw an American kitchen storage room, he nearly broke down. Shelves stacked with flour, sacks of potatoes, rows of canned vegetables. More food than a German town might see in a month. Another POW recalled staring at a loaf of bread for several minutes before touching it, unable to believe it was real. To the Americans, it was everyday life. To the prisoners, it was a reminder of everything they had lost. Yet it was also a reminder of something they had forgotten, what it felt like to be nourished, to be treated with a basic level of care. The food gap between Germany and America wasn't just a difference in resources. It was a difference in experience, in hope, in what it meant to feel human again. And for these men, who had spent years starving physically and emotionally, the meals they found in America would soon lead to a moment that none of them could have imagined. The moment when warm mashed potatoes and gravy brought them to tears. For many German POWs, their first real meal in an American camp became a memory they carried for the rest of their lives. It usually happened not during the first chaotic hours of arrival, but the first time they were marched into the camp dining hall. A long wooden building filled with the smell of warm food, clattering trays, and rising steam. For men who had survived years of hunger, that smell alone felt almost unreal. The kitchen staff, often older American civilians or soldiers unfit for combat, prepared simple dishes, but in quantities the prisoners had not seen in years. On that particular day, the menu was plain by American standards. Mashed potatoes, brown gravy, green beans, soft bread, and a serving of meatloaf. Nothing fancy, nothing extravagant. But for the POWs, it looked like a feast. Many prisoners hesitated as they reached the serving line. Some stared at the large scoops of smooth potatoes, unsure if they were really meant for them. Others whispered to each other, wondering if the portions would be taken away, or if there was some mistake. A few instinctively hid extra bread in their pockets, a habit born from long months of starvation. When they sat down at the long wooden tables, the room grew strangely quiet. Forks scraped gently against metal trays. No one spoke. They were too focused, too overwhelmed by the simple act of eating food that was warm, soft, and plentiful. Some POWs later said the first bite of mashed potatoes felt like a shock, creamy, buttery, comforting in a way that awakened emotions they had buried under fear and exhaustion. Then, the moment that would be retold for decades happened. A young POW, nobody remembers his name, only that he had been thin, pale, and barely older than 20, took a single bite of the mashed potatoes with gravy. He paused, stared at his tray, and suddenly began to cry. Not loud sobs, just quiet, uncontrollable tears rolling down his cheeks. At first, the other prisoners were confused. They thought he might be sick or in pain. But then more men began to wipe their eyes, swallowing hard, pretending it was nothing. The truth was simple. It had been years since they had eaten something warm, filling, and made with care. Years since food had tasted like comfort rather than survival. Years since they felt treated not as soldiers or enemies, but as human beings. One American guard witnessed the scene and later wrote about it in a letter home. He said he had never imagined a plate of mashed potatoes could make grown men cry. To him, it was just dinner. To them, it was a reminder of home, of mothers cooking in small German kitchens, of childhood meals eaten before the world turned into smoke and rubble. The taste brought back memories they thought the war had taken forever. As the prisoners continued eating, some tried to hide their emotions, turning their faces away. Others simply stared at their plates, overwhelmed. The realization sunk in slowly. For the first time in years, they were not starving. They were safe, fed, and treated with a dignity they had not expected from the enemy they had been taught to fear. After that day, the story spread through the camp. "The Americans gave us food like kings," one POW later recalled. "And when I tasted the potatoes, I cried because I finally remembered what it felt like to be alive." The meal was simple, but its meaning ran deep. It marked the moment when many German POWs began to see the United States not as a faceless enemy, but as a place where even prisoners were treated with decency. It was a moment when the war, for a brief second, felt far away. And it all began with a plate of mashed potatoes and gravy, warm, ordinary, yet powerful enough to bring hardened soldiers to tears. For many German POWs, that first warm American meal did more than fill an empty stomach. It quietly reshaped their understanding of the world, of the enemy, and even of themselves. What happened in the dining hall with the mashed potatoes and gravy became a turning point, a moment where fear softened into reflection, and hostility gave way to something unexpected: humanity. In the weeks that followed, the prisoners often spoke about the meal in hushed tones. Some remembered the exact smell of the gravy, others the softness of the potatoes or the warmth rising from the plate. But what stayed with them most was the way the Americans treated them. Not with cruelty or vengeance, but with a calm, steady respect. For soldiers who had braced for punishment or humiliation, this treatment felt almost unreal. Slowly, the emotional impact of that first meal began to ripple through the camp. Prisoners who had arrived suspicious and withdrawn started to relax. Guards who initially kept their distance noticed that the POWs behaved more openly, more cooperatively. Meals became moments of quiet connection. Simple exchanges, small smiles, brief conversations that chipped away at the psychological walls built by years of propaganda and war. Some POWs began volunteering for camp work, farming, carpentry, cooking, repairing tools. They took pride in these tasks because, for the first time in a long time, they felt useful again. Not as soldiers fighting a war they no longer believed in, but as ordinary men engaged in ordinary life. The American staff, seeing their sincerity, often responded with gestures of kindness, offering extra bread, giving them books, organizing music events, or allowing them to write longer letters home. For many prisoners, the most life-changing realization was that their enemy did not hate them. They had grown up hearing that Americans were brutal, greedy, or uncultured. Yet here, thousands of miles from home, the people they were taught to fear were feeding them, sheltering them, and treating them with fairness. This realization sparked something deep inside, an understanding that the world was far more complicated than the slogans painted on Nazi posters or shouted by party officials. Years later, countless former POWs would tell their children and grandchildren that America, ironically, was the place where they first experienced dignity during the war. One man recalled that the meal with mashed potatoes was the first moment he felt hope since 1939. Another wrote in his memoir that the kindness he received in captivity changed the direction of his life, so much so that he eventually returned to the United States, became a citizen, and worked as a baker, always remembering the taste that had first made him cry. Letters home from POW camps often surprised families in Germany. They described good treatment, enough food, and even a sense of peace. These letters became lifelines, proof that not all parts of the world were collapsing into brutality. For some, it planted the first seeds of a belief that reconciliation, even after so much destruction, was possible. As the war drew to an end and the prisoners prepared to return home, many felt conflicted. They longed for their families, yet they knew they were leaving behind a place where they had rediscovered what it meant to be human. On the final days in camp, some Americans shook their hands, offered them small gifts, or simply wished them luck. These simple gestures were remembered for decades. The moment with the mashed potatoes and gravy may have seemed small, but for those POWs, it became a symbol of something far greater. The idea that kindness could cut through the bitterness of war, that humanity could survive even in the darkest times, and that sometimes the most powerful acts are the simplest ones. It was, ultimately, not just a meal, but a quiet, unforgettable reminder that compassion has the power to change lives.